Hey everybody, it's Chris with Xano, and I'm super excited to talk to you today about signing in with Apple. This has been a long time coming. We've worked super hard to bring this to you today. We want to enable you to allow your users to sign in with their Apple ID in your website or application and exchange that for a Xano Auth token, which they can then use to make authenticated requests against your Xano APIs. As you are probably aware, if you were building an application for an Apple device, such as an iPhone or an Apple TV, if you offer certain sign-in methods with other services, for example, signing in with Google or Twitter or Facebook, something along those lines, you are also required to provide a sign-in with Apple option. So we're super happy to be able to offer you a way to do this in Xano using the sign-in with Apple REST API. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this is not for beginners. This is going to be a very complex example, and it's not going to be easy to implement. Something I will also mention is this is not a ready-made solution that you can drop into a no-code front end. This is going to require some custom implementation. We're going to walk you through it as best we can. Of course, we're happy to answer any questions you have as we go. But just please understand upfront that this is going to take some time and effort to implement. Now, of course, we are offering these API endpoints pre-built for you to use in your Xano workspaces right away. So whenever you're ready, you can check that link in the description and get started. In this video, we're going to walk you through the entire flow for a user to sign in with their Apple ID using the REST API that Apple provides. We're going to show you how you can exchange the token that is returned from Apple for a Xano authentication token, and then you can use that token to make Xano authenticated requests. We will also show you an example of implementation, but again, this is going to vary greatly depending on your use case, so please keep that in mind. And with all that out of the way, let's get started. So here we are looking at the Sign In with Apple REST API documentation. So this documentation gives you an overview of how this API works and how you can use it to validate users. Now, we've of course done all of the legwork for you, but I think it's still important to give you an overview of how this actually works. So essentially, the way that this flow works is we call an Apple API to generate a URL. That URL is where the user is redirected to actually sign in with Apple. That brings them to the Sign In with Apple page. They enter their credentials. They choose whether or not to share their email with the service that they're signing into. And then finally, they are redirected back to that service, to your application. So what we're doing here is we are authenticating users with Sign In with Apple. And you can see an example of the flow here. We have our app, which calls the Apple API. We call the API, we provide our credentials, we ask for the type of return that we want, and we ask for the scope of what we want. So we're able to ask for the name, the email, or both from the Apple user. Now, it is undetermined at this time. However, it does seem that the API no longer returns the name of the Apple user. So really, we're just going to focus on getting the email today. So once we call that API and that user verifies their credentials with Apple, Apple returns the real user information and the email, if it is requested, back to your application. Your application can then use that information to create a user account on your end with any other information that you need that you ask the user to provide. And then that user can continue to use your application and continue to sign in with Apple. Now, the really cool thing about this is it's generally speaking a very similar flow between sign in and sign up. So you don't really have to do a whole lot of work in terms of making sure that those two different flows operate. They all kind of go to the same place. Once that is all done, Apple sends back a JWT token with the following information. So most of this we're not going to have to worry about. It's information that verifies that this is actually coming from Apple. We have a timestamp and an expiration. This is the big thing right here. We have the user's email that's associated with their Apple ID. So you're going to get this back in an encoded token. So it's not human readable. We can actually decode it to pull out the user's email and then perform whatever logic we need to actually add them as a user in our application. When we actually call the Apple API, we're sending the following information. We're sending the client ID and the client secret, which is provided in our Apple developer portal. We're also specifying a grant type, and in this case, we're just going to be working with authorization codes. We're not working with refresh tokens today. And then finally, we're providing a redirect URI, which is where the authorization request is redirected to after Apple provides a response. Okay, so here we are in our Apple developer portal. We're going to need to do some setup before we can get started actually using these APIs. So once you're signed in to your Apple developer account, you're going to go right over here to the sidebar and click identifiers. And then we're going to click this plus sign here. On this first screen, we are going to select App ID and click Continue. The type that we want is an app, and now we need to give it a description. So let's just call this one Sign in with Apple Demo. And for the bundle ID, this is really just something that you're going to be using internally. Let's go ahead and just say com.xano.appledemo. And now under the capabilities, we need to scroll down and we want to enable sign in with Apple. And then we can press continue. We can click register. Now that this is done, we need to create a services ID. So we'll go over here to the right and we'll check services ID, and let's go ahead and press the plus sign. And you can see services ID is selected. So we will press continue. The description, again, we'll just use sign in with Apple Demo. For our identifier, we're going to use com.xano.signinAppleDemo, and we'll click continue and then register. We're going to click on the identifier we just made, and we're going to enable sign in with Apple. And now we need to click configure. And now we need to provide some URLs that Apple will use as a whitelist so it knows exactly where your users can be redirected after they have signed in with Apple. If you don't have the URL here, the user will not be redirected. So you need to first provide your domain name and then exact URLs in the box below. Once you've done that, you'll just click next, and then you'll confirm on the next screen, and you're done. And now finally, back on the main screen, we need to navigate to keys, and we need to click the plus sign to create a new key, and we need to give our key a name. And let's go ahead and check sign in with Apple, and we'll click configure. And now we just need to select our primary app ID, and then click save, and continue, and register. You'll need to download the key. You cannot download this again. You have to do it now, or you can click done and come back and download it later. If for some reason you have trouble here and you need to get a key again, you will have to generate a new one. So the next thing we need to do is we need to generate a client secret. It's essentially an encoded key that we need to send to Apple when making authenticated requests. And that also means it's finally time to jump into Xano. We've of course built this function for you, but let me show you how it works. So what we need to do is we need to first create a payload. So what is this key going to contain? So this token that we need to generate is actually detailed in this section of Apple's documentation, generate and validate tokens. So what do we need for this? We need to set our Apple team ID, which you can find in a couple of different places, but in the developer portal, it's going to be right up here in the upper right-hand corner. So this is our team ID right under our name. This value is essentially identifying who's actually creating this client secret. That's us. The next value is IAT. IAT is just the time that this token is issued at. So all we do there is we provide a timestamp. The next path is AUD, or audience. So that is, who is this client secret intended for? It's intended to go to Apple. So we put in the URL that Apple provides here. Final path that we need to set is called sub, and this one is sort of similar to audience, but we're dialing it down a little bit more specifically to what application or what service are we generating this key for. So we need to provide our Apple service ID, which we generated previously. So after we've generated that payload, now we're actually building the token. So the token requires a few more parameters. So we're setting ALG, which is short for algorithm. That's just the algorithm that we're using to encode this key. We're sending KID, which is your Apple developer ID. This is going to be your team ID, again, in the upper right-hand corner in your developer portal. and then we are setting the type of token, which is JWT, and then finally we're providing the actual key. This is the key file that you downloaded previously. Just open it up in any plain text editor, copy it, and you can paste it right here, or you can do as we've done and store it in an environment variable, which is usually a little bit easier to manage. So that's what we've done here. So what have we done so far? Let's recap a little bit. We've gone through our Apple Developer Portal. We've created an app ID and a service ID for our application so we can actually enable the sign in with Apple functionality. And now we've generated the token that we need to send to Apple with all of that information so we can get started with the authentication process. Again, the link to Apple's documentation is going to be down below, and all of these functions and endpoints that I'm going to show you are also pre-built down in the description as well. Now that we have this token built, we can actually begin the authentication flow. What does that look like? Well, let's go over to our APIs, and let's take a look at this one right here. This one is called OAuth Apple init. So this endpoint is responsible for generating the URL that sends one of your users to Apple to become authorized. We have one input here, which is just the redirect URI. This is going to be the same URI that you gave to Apple earlier. And let's see what this function is doing. So this function is taking that redirect URI, and then we're just creating a variable with the client secret, the redirect URI. We're specifying a response type. This is going to be different depending on exactly the type of response that you need for your application. Check Apple's documentation for more details on that. Same with the response mode. This is going to be different depending on the type of information that you need specifically, but typically speaking, form post is going to be versatile enough for you to work with it however you need. And it's what we need to actually make it work in Xano the way that we want. And then finally, we're providing a scope. Now, I do want to make a small note here, which we also mentioned earlier, that the scope can be name or email or both. That is supposed to provide you with the full name and the email address of the Apple user. We unfortunately were not able to get Apple to pick up the name scope, and it does seem like potentially that's something that's being phased out. We're honestly not entirely sure, but we at least get the email, and then we can ask the user for any additional information that we need once they've been signed in. And now let's take a look at OAuth Apple Continue. So once your user has signed in with their Apple ID, this is where the user's information is returned. So the first thing we're doing is we are getting the access token, which means we're just generating that JWT token that we talked about earlier, and we're sending it to Apple. And then we are decoding the token that we receive back from Apple. And how are we doing that? We're taking the token, we're just using a split filter, and then we are using base64 decode because it is base64 encoded, and then we're using JSON decode to actually decode that raw data into a standard JSON format. And then finally, we are trading that token. How are we trading that token? So the first thing we do is we take in the input from the previous step, which is that decoded Apple authorization token. We're checking to see if a record already exists for that user based on their email address. If the record does exist, then we're getting that user record, and then we are generating a Xano authentication token for them. If the user record does not exist, then we are adding a record to the user table using the email provided from Apple, and then we're generating an authentication token, and then we are returning that authentication token. Now this user has traded their Apple account for a user account in Xano and can make authenticated requests against your Xano endpoints. The last thing I want to show you is I just want to show it to you in action, and I want to show you what happens in the Xano database. So you can see here in our user table, what I'm looking for is chris@xano.com. It's not here, right? I haven't signed up for this application. So let's go ahead and sign up. So I'm going to go to my API, which generates that URL. That's the OAuth Apple init. And I'm going to provide my own redirect URI. Remember, this is going to be different based on your specific application. This is the same URL that you provided to Apple earlier when we were generating our app and service IDs. So let's run this, and we get a URL back. Putting this in the context of working with your front end would call this API endpoint and return this URL, which your front end would then ideally either throw up a pop-up or probably just redirect the user to, would make more sense most of the time. Totally up to you how you want to handle that. So let's go to this URL. So you can see now we're taken to an Apple sign-in page. It says use your Apple ID to sign in to Xano Test Sign In. So let's go ahead and sign in. And now we can see it says, do you want to continue using Xano Test Sign In with your Apple ID, chris@xano.com? I do, so I'm going to hit continue. And now we get a big mess, right? So this makes sense, and let me tell you why. Because we're really only able to give you the bare building blocks for making this work. This is the response that we get from the continue API. This is the Apple token, and this is our Xano authentication token. So let me take this and make it a little bit easier to read, and then I'll show you exactly what we're looking at. So we get three separate objects back. We get the API response, we get the decoded user, and then we get the Xano authentication token. So let's look at the API response. So this is the raw response that Apple has sent us back. We're probably not going to work too much with this data. And then we have our decoded user. And you can see we get some of the data that we've sent into Apple that's just returned the same. But then we have the user email. So this is the email that belongs to the user's Apple ID. Now, if they choose to not share their email with you, then you will receive one of those, then you will receive an Apple private relay email in place. So that is something to keep in mind there when you're collecting other information from your users after they've connected their Apple account. You may need something else to identify them with. And then finally, we have an authentication token. So this is a Xano authentication token that we can use to run Xano authenticated endpoints. Now, to show you how that works, what I'm going to do is I have a very simple endpoint here that I'm going to enable authentication for in Xano. And let's go ahead and just do a quick query all records and return the result. What I just want to demonstrate is finally taking that token and making a Xano authenticated request. So let's go back to our raw result here and let's find our auth token. I know it's very small, I apologize. Let's copy this and let's run. And then we're just going to paste this auth token right here and we click run and we're able to run the endpoint successfully, which means that we are now authenticated and can make Xano authenticated requests. So your user can continue to use all of the features of your application after they have signed in or signed up with their Apple ID. It's really cool. Okay, so we're almost done. It's the home stretch. I just really want to show you a full in-action version of signing in with Apple using Xano on a published website. Very basic example here. We just have a sign in with Apple button. So let's go ahead and click it and we'll see what happens. We get a pop-up that takes us to the sign in with Apple page. So what actually happened here? We called the OAuth Apple init API in Xano to get this URL. The redirect URI was provided by some custom JavaScript code, which we'll go ahead and leave down in the description as well if you want to look at a pre-made example of using this with JavaScript. Let's go ahead and sign in. Do we want to continue using Xano Test Sign In with my Apple ID? Yes, I do. And after we hit continue, the pop-up is closed. We're taken back to our website. That response from Apple is sent to Xano, and our account has been traded for a Xano authentication token. I definitely recommend taking a look at this code example in the description so you can get an idea of what a full implementation looks like. So now that we've gone through the entire Apple sign-in API, we know how all of these endpoints and functions work in Xano, and we understand the basic flow for user authentication using sign-in with Apple. How do you actually add this to your Xano workspace? Let me show you how. So you're going to click the link in the description below, which is going to take you to a snippet. A snippet is essentially pre-built functions and APIs and database table structure that you can use in your own Xano workspace. We want to eventually move this over to an official extension, but for now, we wanted to make sure to get this available to you as quickly as possible. So we have it available in a snippet. So when you click the link, this is the page that you're taken to. And if we want to go ahead and actually add these functions and endpoints to our database, all we need to do is click this Add to your Xano account. And you're going to be asked to sign in again. Once you've signed in, you're going to be asked to choose an instance, and then you just click Add to Instance. And then you can see it says, congratulations, the Xano snippet has been added to your instance. And now we can just navigate right back to our instance. And then we're going to go over here to this Marketplace tab on the left, and we're going to click Purchased. And you should see the Sign In with Apple REST API here. So we'll click that. And then we just click Install Snippet, and then Install down at the bottom. The next thing you're going to want to do is you can see this little notification that says this extension needs to be configured. We'll click Configure, and this is where you need to fill in that information from the Apple Developer Portal. This is your service ID, your key ID. This is the private key, that file that you downloaded. You need to copy the contents from that file and just paste it right in there. And then finally, your team ID, which is available in the upper right-hand corner of your Developer Portal. Once you have all this information filled in, you should be able to go into the API and use the OAuth Apple init API endpoint to generate a sign in with Apple URL. Once you use that URL and sign in, you should see a new user created in your user database table. Just like that. Very cool. You are now ready to implement Apple sign in your application using Xano as a backend. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope it helps you implement sign in and sign up with Apple into your applications that are using Xano as a backend. Now, I do again want to reiterate, I know that was a lot. There's still a lot that's going to have to be custom built for you. You are going to have to take the reins and figure out how to integrate it into your front end of choice. However, having these endpoints built and ready to go for you is going to save you a lot of time in finally implementing sign in with Apple. We definitely want to hear about how you're able to use this, so please leave some comments down below or join us on the Xano community, or you can even talk to us inside Xano support chat. Let us know how it's going. We know this is super important, and we want to make sure that we do everything we can to enable you to make this work for you. All the links you need are down in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.